Hi, everyone. My name is João. I'm from Portugal. I'm one of the co-executive directors at the TUMO Portugal, where we have 3 centers. What you'll see next is a conversation between me and Pegor Papazian, the Chief Development Officer at TUMO. This conversation was recorded in Yerevan. In this conversation, we discussed TUMO's educational philosophy, the schooling system, learning efficiency, and AI in education. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that this is valuable for your ambassadorship and your local representation of TUMO in your own centers and countries. Pegor, good morning.
Hi,
Thanks so much for accepting and conceding this interview.
my pleasure.
So it's going to be a very informal conversation, and we'll go with the flow, and we'll cover stuff from TUMO philosophy to much broader education topics. So starting with one that is very much TUMO related, just as a way of introducing. So since the first contact with TUMO, we hear about the walk-away pedagogy or walk-away as an educational philosophy.
Yep.
And I kind of never thought of it as a real pedagogy when you compare it to like Montessori or Waldorf or something like that. But I have always interpreted it more of an experience design challenge. So what would happen if we design a educational program where learners can walk away anytime, and how that influence the design? Or if students are not forced to come, how should we design the instructional experience? Is this like a reasonable interpretation, or am I missing something in what this walk away means?
No, I think that's absolutely right. But it is, we call it pedagogy because it is the basis of all the pedagogical kind of apparatus that we then develop. It's kind of the test, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it doesn't work in a walk-away setting, then it doesn't work. In other words, if you need some kind of extrinsic motivation to be able to kind of make the system reach effective learning outcomes, it's not part of our pedagogical approach. So in that sense, it's at the basis of the pedagogy. And it really, it's a very simple concept, which is about intrinsic motivation versus motivation hacks. So schools, for example, use grades, sometimes punishment, maybe not as much any longer, prizes, right? EdTech companies use gamification, which we don't like.
Mm-hmm.
These are all extrinsic sources of motivation, and they work, but they work in very particular settings. They have a lot of victims at the end, and they're not long lasting. So after the process is over, after the school day, they almost have the opposite effect of kids hating to study because sometimes, right? Some of them love them, but the minority, because it was imposed extrinsically. Whereas if somehow you find a way of tapping into intrinsic motivation and reinforcing that, that's what we call walk-away pedagogy. In that sense, it's a pedagogical principle.
Cool. Yeah. And if in this context, if learners are free to disengage, so if learners are free to walk away,
right,
what does that reveal about what we must earn from students, from learners, in order for this to work?
Right. Yeah. In the end, it's a learner's right issue. What you have to earn from them is you have to convince them that what you're giving them is valuable to them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're very smart. The kids are not stupid. They know exactly. The reason they have a short attention span, which we complain about, is because they're smart. They don't want to spend more time than is reasonable for something whose value is not commensurate with what you're giving them. So they do want to learn math. They do want to succeed, be cool, be rich. They have the normal aspirations.
Mm-hmm.
They also want to be happy, of course. And they understand that education, learning things, is a gateway to that. But the learning has to be commensurate with the investment that they're putting in.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you have to earn from them is what you earn from a client, let's say, which is respect for what you're offering them as something that they would value.
And you mentioned the apparatus, and now connecting to this, what are so how do you put that in practice? What are the instructional design features of TUMO that respond to this? Or in other words, how do we keep students engaged and comply with this that you just said?
Yeah. So there's the micro level, and there's the micro level of instructional design, right? At the macro level, it's about choice, first and foremost. So first of all, starting from the principle that if you're learning something valuable, it matters less that it's a specific thing. It matters more that there's a lot of it and the learning is effective and valuable, right? And so some kids will gravitate towards drawing and graphic design at TUMO. In the school setting, they might gravitate more towards sciences, etc. Other kids will choose some other path, computer programming, AI. In school, it might be, I don't know, music or whatever. And it's not the case that we don't need people who have artistic skills or we don't need people who have technical skills. We need both. And allowing them to maximize what they find valuable and to maximize their own skills and happiness and effectiveness in that one direction by choosing it is one of the key macro level principles of how you implement walkaway pedagogy, right? So personalization is a term we used to use a lot. And now we're using it a bit less because we realize that even within personalization, there's this assumption that I know what you need. I'm going to personalize the teaching for you. It's probably much more effective if you personalize your own learning. And so this more conversational style, and this
it's a self-personalization.
Self-personalization through a conversation with the resources, right? But that's important. It's important that we don't assume that people know what they need or what they want. They have to discover it. So you have to give them choice also in the sense of a lot of things to try, right? So that's one. But at the micro level, we have a bunch of tricks. For example, this idea of what we call a spiral design. Not the perfect term, not the perfect metaphor, but the idea is the following, that very soon within the learning process, it's great if you can produce results, if you can do self-expression using what you just learned.
See the output.
And that's not just because it reinforces what you just learned, but it also feeds into that process of, oh, this is valuable. I'm actually able to do stuff with this. So it's the opposite of sometimes the way my kids were taught Russian when we moved to Armenia, which was first you learn the words, then you put them together in a sentence. So you can't say a sentence until you've kind of mastered lots of words. And in the process, you're not sure if this is going to pay off. So you might give up, right? Okay. So those are just two examples at macro and micro level of walkaway pedagogy translated to instruction.
So would it be, with this that you just said, would it be fair to assume that the skill areas that we have at TUMO are almost an excuse to build this journey that builds these skills and this long-term learning desire?
That's right, but with a nuance, right? So it's true that our goal is not to teach mastery in Photoshop, right? Or Python or whatever. That's not the goal. The goal is more to teach how to become a super learner, to be able to have this intrinsic motivation, initiative, being able to communicate, to organize yourself, to learn new things, etc. But we can't do it without the Photoshop. We don't know how. That's not, we've tried to kind of to build those, what sometimes are called soft skills. I don't like that word, but these more fundamental skills. Without teaching the technical hard skills, we haven't been able to make that work. So we rely a lot on teaching these hard skills, coding, etc., which then generate this flywheel of self-expression and wanting to learn more. And if the learner doesn't have the tools, the technical hard skill tools to practice those more fundamental skills and to develop them, it doesn't quite work. So yes, our goal is not to teach Python and Photoshop, but teaching Python and Photoshop is absolutely needed in the process. It has a nice side effect, which is you might get a job in Python.
You might actually develop skills. Yes. But it is clearly secondary, a very required, but not a necessary, but a secondary kind of objective.
Yeah. And with AI, that's becoming more and more apparent because who knows if you'll need even Python in a year or two.
Okay. And I mean, you mentioned the personalization and this nuance of how much personalization or this self-personalization.
Right.
One of the topics we see in Portugal is related to special needs students, so special learning needs.
Yep.
So I'm not even referring to like very deep special needs, but like learning disabilities like dyslexia or severe ADHD. Right. Do you think that TUMO responds well? So this would be the ultimate personalization in a way, right? So if you have this characteristic in how you learn, the program can, or the experience can cater to that. Do you think that the TUMO program as it is built responds well to these students, or how can we approach this personalization in this context?
There's some aspects in which we're great for those kinds of students because we offer a lot of choice, and so they can gravitate to areas where they feel that their, let's say, disabilities, dyslexia, for example, is not an impediment, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not enough. We're not there yet in terms of being able to maximize opportunities for those people, for those kids, mm-hmm. At the extremes, right? So, for example, if you have a vision disability, you don't see well, or you're blind, then it's very hard to consume or to work with the tool. It's a pity because there's nothing intrinsic about that condition that would prevent you from learning any of the skill mm-hmm. areas. It's just that we don't have the tools and the platform in place mm-hmm. to cater to that. That's something we need to fix. It's one of our kind of missing pieces. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we'll get there.
Awesome. Back to the traits or the features of the walkaway. You typically mentioned that you have this students need alone time. That's what yes. we have with self-learning. And then, but you also value the group work that typically you get with labs or with workshops. Sure. What is the role of community? So in a wider sense, so there's groups in workshops and labs at a small scale. Mm-hmm. There's those like 4 or 5 students or 3 or 4. Do you think that TUMO builds a sense of wider community? And if yes, does this happen by design or this happens by accident in a way?
Right. No, it is by design. First of all, starting with the fact that it's in person. Mm-hmm. It would be so much less expensive and we would reach so many more people if we did it online. But we don't, because for us, it doesn't work. Precisely for that reason, that the community, personal interactions, the desire to be cool among friends, the desire to help others, etc., those are very real and they're very key drivers of the learning process. Not to mention the fact that they develop social and personal skills that are very important. Mm-hmm. Now, the alone time, it actually plays in favor of that. So we have episodes within the TUMO learning process where you're learning by yourself, the self-learning. Mm-hmm. But you're surrounded by other kids. You're surrounded by coaches, so you're not feeling alone per se. It's just that you can go at your own pace. That allows kids who are less privileged in the sense of they don't have a computer at home, or even they're dyslexic and it takes them more time to consume something. It allows them to find an on-ramp into workshops that's at their pace, and therefore less competition, and therefore less marginalization. Mm-hmm. And so the social dynamic is reinforced by the fact that you can have alone time. But then ultimately your goal, your challenge is to jump into a workshop. So you have to do that. Mm-hmm. With the advantage that if you have a really bad dynamic with the kids in the workshop, a month later, it's okay. You're going to be in another workshop with other kids. So it'll work out.
Do you think that the fact that there's a certain rhythm to the learning path, so the 4-week cycles, and I mean, you might be two consecutive cycles in self-learning, but there's always like a real limitation until you swap what you just meant. Do you think that is a critical part of the path, of the journey?
I think so, but
experience?
Yeah, I wouldn't claim that the 4-week cycle has anything magical about it. It's more a practical thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's timed based on the length of a workshop, that less doesn't seem to work, more is not necessary. So mm-hmm. the smallest modular, let's say, atomic piece mm-hmm. of learning in group settings. But yes, the alternating between self-learning and workshop, and then occasionally interspersed with labs, that rhythm does help a lot because, first of all, it brings cognitive variety, mm-hmm. which is important so you don't kind of zone out. Mm-hmm. It also ties into something I hope we'll touch on a bit more in a bit, which is it's hard to learn without effort and a bit of suffering. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of puts you in this video game type dynamic of earning mm-hmm. entry into a workshop, for example.
Without too much gamification.
Without any gamification. Yeah. I just say like a video game, because in the sense that you can get as many little points as you want, that's not going to mm-hmm. earn you our respect, let's say.
Yes. Okay.
What will earn our respect is if you do something cool in a workshop. And so ultimately, that's what's going to be rewarded. And it's not a reward that we offer in terms of grades or diplomas. It's your own reward. But it can't be replaced with golden mushrooms.
Is there a hierarchy to the... So if we think of these three pedagogical approaches, the self-learning, the workshops, and the labs, from your perspective, is there a hierarchy? So you just define like self-learning is in a way a way to get to a workshop. That's mechanically true, like we all know that. But is there a hierarchy of a workshop being more valuable than a self-learning cycle, or a lab being more valuable than a workshop?
I would say yes, because the workshop yields the biggest learning outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the obvious reasons. It's hands-on, it's project-based, it's group-based, etc. And you're making something that spans days, not minutes. And so, yes, what we measure is success is successful participation in workshops.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't count how many self-learning activities you've done. We count how many workshops you've achieved.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay if you have to do lots of self-learning before getting into that. That doesn't kind of diminish in any way the process. And of course, you learn things during self-learning, so there's obviously value there. But yes, there's a hierarchy in terms of workshops is what the measure of success is for ourselves to see if kids are engaged and are learning.
Okay, and just bringing back one of the in one of the previous questions, you mentioned free choice as one of the anchors or arcs of the pedagogical design. Right. And obviously this was in the context of choosing different skill areas. And I think it's very consensual. That's very valuable. But in a wider context, when we are designing experiences for educational experiences for teenagers, is there a limit to free choice? And when can free choice be a deterrent of value? If in any case that you can think of.
Well, one distinction I'd like to make is when we talk about free choice, we're talking about the learning domain.
Okay.
We're also pretty liberal in terms of, for example, how you dress. We don't have any opinions about that. But that's because we're liberal and because we kind of respect the kids' space. Mm-hmm. It's not a pedagogical imperative, right? And sometimes it does work in the opposite direction. So, for example, we've had some lab leaders who come from a background where self-expression and doing your own thing has a very high value. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we have to tell them, no, the kids actually need to be a bit stressed, trying to achieve something, trying to learn, and not just having a great time expressing themselves. And that sometimes shocks people because we thought you were like very Montessori style, anything goes. And so I don't think that's how Montessori works, but that's the stereotype. Yeah. And no, we're pretty, in a sense, if you look at the TUMO platform, it's kind of like a factory, right? It's very standardized. Mm-hmm. It's very much about these very specific atoms of learning that you put into these long molecules of the learning.
But it has diversity and gives a certain level of agency to students.
That's right. But it's not open and do whatever. It's not it's a resource center. You come in, you have the tools, you do what you want, or the one laptop per child approach, if you remember that.
It's not a playground.
It's not a playground. It's not, you give them the tools and they'll figure it. No, it's very much on rails in a sense, while giving maximum choice as far as the learning process itself. And so, yeah, that's a distinction. So I think we don't have strong opinions about choice when it comes to, for example, we ask you to choose 2 days in the week when you have to come in Yerevan, for example. We do that out of a practical sense of otherwise it wouldn't work.
Of course.
We don't think that's an issue, the fact that you can't come whenever you want. That would be maximum choice, but that's not what we're talking about.
Yes, okay. And so I wanted to bring one very specific example, which is about mobile phone usage.
Okay.
Where in Yerevan, as far as I understand, there's no limitations to that.
That's right.
But for example, in Portugal, we do have a full limitation of usage of mobile phones within TUMO.
Right.
And we do feel that has an impact. Is that something, where would you put this in in like is it more of a dress code type of free choice option, or is it? Do you think this could actually have this specific example could actually be where we force students to like concentrate more in a way, or not have this distraction, or not use double screens, which is like something that is very weird in a way.
Look, I want to answer that in two ways. One, no, it's not. We don't mind. It's not a violation of the TUMO pedagogy because again, it's in the dress code, let's say, category, and so it's perfectly okay to have that limitation. If you think that's needed, I'd love to debate that aspect almost out of intellectual curiosity, but not from the perspective of the TUMO police, let's say. Yeah. On the other hand, if you really have this perfect walkaway pedagogy setting where kids are completely immersed in the learning process as they are in a video game, or when kids who like to play chess are playing chess, they don't look at their phones. I mean, sometimes they do because they want to exchange some message on Discord, but not to look at social media when they're playing video game. So that's the nirvana. Ideally, you would allow them to bring the phones and they would not even look at them.
Okay. And still on this, like on this flow, how much should a learning coach, for example, this is one of the operational debates we have in Portugal, which is how much should a learning coach push? So obviously the learning coach should never give answers to self-learning activities. That's not the point. It's more about enablement and facilitation. But at the end of the day, like you said, there's a journey. Students have their own objectives. Part of the motivation is seeing them fulfill some of their objectives. And to a certain extent, we do feel that sometimes maybe pressure is not the right word, but like some a little bit more support, sitting down next to a student. Do you feel that this is okay, and this is part of the facilitation and enablement a learning coach should do, or does that go into somewhat of an imposition towards the students?
No, I think it's appropriate and to a certain extent, and I would do it by analogy to the reason they're called a coach is a running coach, for example. The running coach will often kind of, depending on the style and depending on their judgment of the athlete, they might even raise their voice. Try harder, run, keep going. And that's exactly what the runner wants and needs, right? So if you make the judgment right, and that's why coaches have to be human and not AIs, is because they can make those judgments, they can develop those relationships. So the ideal coach would find the right balance and would not be completely hands-off. Tell me if you need anything. No, like, there's a learning lab coming up in animation. I know you love animation, but the way you're going, you're not going to make it. Are you happy with that? That's appropriate. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Question number 2.
Yeah.
This was just the first question.
This was one. Oh,
yes.
Wow.
So question number 2. So you've described TUMO as a response to what traditional schooling gets wrong. My first question is a little bit more philosophical, which is, why do we have schooling and schooling system? Is it just about instruction? Or basically, what is the school for? School as in the school system apparatus of the typical national educational system.
Look, let me start by saying it's very easy to illustrate some of the principles behind TUMO by comparing them disfavorably to schools, schools being the disfavorable part. But it's a bit unfair because what schools are asked to do, it's heroic what they pull off in a way, teachers and principals, because they are working under the constraint of a national education standard, right? And if TUMO were try to meet those education standards, which doesn't allow any choice, which is all about extrinsic motivation in a way, because in the sense that the state requires that you give them grades at the end of the day, and it requires that you give diplomas. TUMO would fail completely. So it's not like we're these heroes that could do the same job, only better. No, we're doing a very different job in the sense that what's common is education and learning. We do it better in a sense because we're playing by different games. So in the unfair competition kind of setup. So having said that, what are the things that make the school system in general, so at the political level, the state standards for schooling, etc., sometimes inefficient, ineffective, it's a couple of things. One is they're looking to find elites and nurture them.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about socioeconomic elites. I'm talking about they want to know who's smart and give them the resources to excel and to get to MIT or whatever it is in the US. And that ends up being quite counterproductive. It's not intuitive. You would think that's a smart thing to do because you're thinking, I want somebody to win the Olympic medal. And so I have to make sure early on who's the better athlete, invest in them. The others can be pushed aside or can be suboptimal in a way. Whereas what TUMO is doing is trying to maximize learning outcomes across the whole cohort without picking the winners, if you will. Now, let's go a bit deeper into that. So picking winners, not only does it have the problem of it causes more damage than it brings benefits in the aggregate across the student population, it also doesn't work. On my LinkedIn, I shared an article from The Economist recently, which is about a study that shows in very clear terms that if you look at top performers in academia, in athletics, in a couple of fields that they studied, and you look if these top performers were identified as kind of the elite or the smart ones or the talented ones early in their life, it turns out it's not the case. So the very top performers were not identified early on.
So they didn't specialize early.
They didn't specialize. They didn't have specific training. Like in football, for example, they didn't go to special football camps. They did a lot of different things. And the opposite is also true. If you look at the percentage of these kids who are identified as the elite athletes and so on early on, the majority don't get to the top level. It's very clear. And the reasons are pretty obvious if you dig in. This lack of choice makes you kind of demotivated early on. It prevents you from finding what you're really good at. This kid was actually a brilliant, let's say, tennis player, but we specialized them in football early on. That was
the first sport.
That was the first sport. That's what we noticed. That's what the mother wanted. So there we go. And there are a couple of other choices, which I point out in my LinkedIn post. I would encourage you to look at it. And so schools get that part wrong, or the school system. Also the fact of then having to rely on extrinsic motivation in order to overcome that issue of the kids are doing something they didn't want to do necessarily, they weren't good at, they didn't have a chance to explore enough. And so now I have to motivate them with other means, like grades and rewards and things like that, which is not optimal because then it doesn't turn them into lifelong super learners because they've achieved the grade. That's what you wanted them to achieve. Now they can almost like stop. Of course, a lot of positive things have come out of schools, like people like you, right? Successful in your career. You probably were a good student. I don't know. But you weren't like the kid who was failing at school and so on. And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of, look, we trained João. He did great. So we must be doing something right. But in the aggregate, that's not the case. You would have done as well or maybe better, who knows, in a different environment. But all your classmates who did not reach your level might have also reached that level in a different setting. So just the fact that schooling works for some of us doesn't mean that it's the best way of doing things.
Schooling can work at different speeds for different people, right? I think that's one of the points with TUMO.
Different speeds, but also different. Look, in schools, we don't really teach art, for example, right? And the reason we don't teach art is because that's not what the economy is dictating it needs. But in the end, we get surprises. We get this whole kind of gaming industry, which is starving for artists. And with AI, we get this weird kind of now reversal of, let's say, plumbers being much more valuable. Whereas we thought they were kind of the underclass, if you will, who couldn't do math. That's why they're doing plumbing. Now they might make much more money and be much more valuable because of AI. So it's hard to pick winners. It's hard to predict the future. So laying fundamental skills is probably the smartest thing to do.
And back to the kind of the macro question, you mentioned something of the value, more of the professional value in a way. do you think, back to what is the purpose of having a school? Is it fundamental? You just said, is it building fundamental skills and knowledge? Is it more about serving a market? What should the school system be optimizing for?
Right. Well, look, already it does more than what you said. It does socialization, right? The school is where you learn how to interact with other people and so on. And again, it has a lot of negative aspects. Even there, some great schools build very nice humans.
Mm-hmm.
Other schools build very competitive but kind of problematic humans, or even people whose self-worth is damaged in the process. So, but no, their function is clearly, and TUMO's function too, is to build that socio-emotional basis that you need. And yes, schools obviously are geared towards the economy, right? What we teach and so on is always in terms of what does the nation need in terms of, they mean jobs or national security, etc., which is fair, obviously. The only question is, what's the optimal way of achieving that maximum outcome, especially in the long term, in terms of economic growth? And we've seen that places that produce entrepreneurial, self-motivated, self-confident, eager to learn populations will win out at the end, regardless of whether the country has natural resources or started from a strong economic base. The ones that go ahead are the ones that are nurturing these more, let's say, the social capital based on these values and these attitudes and so on.
Okay. And you mentioned one thing right in the beginning of this question, which is the value of schools operating in this restricted system. If you review all of these assumptions, so if you can change all of these assumptions, like having grades and all of that, do you think that TUMO could adjust with all its nuances? If you have like a blank card to do it, do you think that the TUMO model could adjust in terms of scale and depth and diversity to being a common school model, the compulsory school, let's say?
If the question is, can the TUMO model be used to teach math and chemistry and history, etc.? Yes, it would be amazing.
Okay.
It would also be much lower cost per student than schools. It is already. So absolutely. So if you take away this external requirements of the state standards and so on, and do not require that all the students by the same age need to be able to solve two equations with two unknowns, etc., then yes. And then you'll have lots of kids who can do that much better, solve the equation. And the kids who are failing at that at school would still not be mathematicians, but they would not fail. They would succeed at something else, which they're now not succeeding at.
So still on this, if you are invited by the Ministry of Education to change one thing in the current school system, what would that be? Would it be grades? Would it be age cohorts? Would it be time at school? Would it be homework? Would it be subjects? Would it be certification? Which of these variables do you think would have the most leveraging effect in the system?
The education standards.
Okay. So certification?
No, the education standards that say what kids should learn by which age and so on. If those were to change to something that's much more future-proof, and especially these days, in reaction to what AI can do, changing how we measure success in schools, what the goal of the school system is at different ages and different grade levels, I think that's what I would attack for two reasons. One, it's the easiest point of entry because governments especially are used to reviewing their education standards periodically. They're very open to that. And when the new Minister of Education comes in, it's very common for them to say, oh, the previous one was not, and they change that. It's an easy thing to change, as opposed to teachers' salaries are hard to change. Changing the grading system, parents will start panicking, and then universities do not know who to admit. That's where I would start. And I think it's actually something we should be thinking about collectively. By we, I mean the progressive, innovative education community worldwide. about what should the new taxonomy of skills and the new education standards look like, and maybe start there.
Awesome. And this actually ties very well with the next question I had, which is about the value of skills versus knowledge in the context where certification might not be available. So that's the circumstance with TUMO. We do not provide certification.
Right.
We provide portfolio, which that is the demonstration of skills, but it's not a certificate
Right.
in itself. And you kind of already touched this, but I wanted to explore a little bit more of what happens to education if credentials stop being the main currency, which now they are. So you mentioned the standard, but also
Right.
certification is a derivation of that. So if we take certification out, what happens?
Well, look, at the end of the day, where your education, what you know and what you can do, your know-how and knowledge, are need to be demonstrated. What can replace certification is showing what you can do, right? And that's already how the big tech companies are working. They're looking less and less at diplomas. They're looking more and more at your GitHub and your portfolio. And so I think it's a very simple answer. The currency will become your proof of work, as opposed to somebody else's certifying that you can do certain things. It's directly showing what you can do, right?
And if we take that to an extreme, what would be the other system level consequence? So you mentioned the example of recruitment with tech companies, but tech companies are known for being quite progressive and advanced and resourceful. So they are like the early adopters of getting rid of certification as a signal. But a whole bunch of other agents in the community, in society, still depend on the certification as a signaling method that you are able to do A, B, or C. If we evolve into a place where we do not have formal certification, what other system level changes would we require? So, for example, universities typically in Europe, mostly in the US, there's like it's a bit more broad, but in Europe, all of the universities are basically grade only dependent. That would require changing. And this is a very obvious example, but there's other examples. So from salary structure by public administration is depending on formal certification.
Right.
Whatever budgets are, budget salaries progression sometimes are based on formal. So what other things? So we would have to change everything essentially, I guess.
Yeah, but there's a quick interim fix, which is using a portfolio instead of a diploma. Sometimes we call the portfolio that TUMO provides students, where they upload what they've done. We call it a living diploma, by which we mean not that we love diplomas, but that this is a replacement for a diploma, in the sense that now it does take a bit more time to look at it. It's not, you're not just looking at the diploma to see if it's fake or real. You actually have to look to see what work the person has done, right?
And be able to assess that.
And be able to assess it.
Have that capability.
Yes. So it's not as plug and play. It's not as efficient as a diploma, but it's much more effective. And it will overall, it leads to much better outcomes. So that's my answer. Unless you tell me, and plus Pegor, it needs to be as quick and efficient as a diploma or a grade. No, it doesn't have to be.
Okay. So you already mentioned intrinsic motivation, and this is clearly, I mean, from everything you published, something that you believe should be at the center of the learning experience. Do you think that, and again, you have touched this before, but I want to go a little bit deeper do you think that most schools destroy intrinsic motivation, or do they simply fail to notice it and therefore do not nurture it?
I wouldn't say they destroy it, but one realization that we've had about motivation is we've always thought of it as the prerequisite for learning. So if a learner is motivated, they're likely to learn. If they're not, it's not going to happen. We're now seeing that it's actually should be seen as an outcome of the learning process. We strengthening kids' motivation muscles, if you will, is a lot of what TUMO ends up doing. We just now realized it recently, because their appetite to learn things, their appetite to do things grows when they're at TUMO. It's not just we're tapping into that resource and using it to teach them, but actually creating an environment which reinforces that. Now in schools, that happens with the lucky kids who are part of this elite, who have these scholastic kind of mindset. They love to study, test taking works for them. And so they become more and more motivated. They do actually build their motivation muscles. The problem is that for, I would say, the majority, the opposite happens. It's actually a negative in the sense that they feel they were not the best in class. They were not even in the top 10. And so they feel bad about themselves, and they feel bad about this thing, the game itself. So they start hating the game, which they should love, right? Instead of building their motivation to learn, you're teaching them that this learning thing, that was a bad episode in your life. And so, yeah, it does diminish motivation, and we pay a very high price for that.
Last year in Lisbon, in the TUMO Leads meetup, your talk explored the idea of TUMO as a place to build imagination. I think that was how you placed it. Is imagination the concretization of intrinsic motivation? So is imagination the path to building motivation?
Not only. I mean, there's a lot that goes into building motivation. That's not about. I think the part about imagination is this ability to, or the desire to imagine what's possible, what can be. So things that are, so imagination is by definition seeing something which isn't there, right? Which is key to motivation. It's one ingredient, which is striving for the possible. And by definition, striving for something that has not been achieved and might not even be achieved yet. So this idea of accepting the stress and the pain to build your muscles does take some imagination. You have to imagine yourself as this buff person to be able to put in all that effort, right? And so in that sense, yes, but it's not the only or the main driver, because there's so many things that are involved in that process which are not about imagination. So I don't know what I said exactly in Leeds, but I might have overstated it.
That's fair. So in a recent post, and you mentioned this, and this is, I think, one of your favorite recent topics, you framed learning efficiency as mastery and complexity weighed against time. So very openly, can you help me understand exactly what this means?
Right. So first of all, it's really a learner's rights issue, but we'll get to that. So this is a bit of a reaction against this idea that if a student sitting in class learning how to, let's say, solve an equation, x plus 3 equals 10 or something like that, solve for x, spend days to learn how to do that. No one seems to feel that that's a problem as long as they learn it at the end, right? And let's assume they do learn how to do it, they master it. What we're saying is it matters how long it takes to learn. And if you have a way of creating an environment where they learn faster, that's better in a very significant way. And the reasons are, one, you can learn more if you're learning more per day. Learning more is good. Two, a lot of the burnout and kind of becoming apathetic to learning comes from this extended period of time with very little gain at the end. Or yeah, it's valuable to solve equations, but if it's going to take you years to learn it, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe you should do something else. And so it's not just about what you're learning and the level of complexity of the learning outcome, but also how much time it takes to learn. The faster you do it, the more efficient that is. Now, that doesn't mean it needs to be fast. It can be a very long and slow process. It just needs, if you compare two long processes, one is 2 years and the other is 10 years, and you're getting to the same level of mastery, for example, you're becoming a great poet at the end of that. Maybe it's great that you have 8 more years ahead of you as this great poet to develop it even further.
Is this, I mean, one of the other projects, this is a slight detour from TUM, but one of the other projects that we both know very well is School 42. Right. Is this like a good argument for School 42 in the sense that you are still delivering active, workable programmers to the market in a lot less time than what a traditional bachelor's degree would look like?
Yes, except there's a nuance there, which is a traditional bachelor's degree delivers something a bit different.
Okay.
So the fact that they can both program doesn't mean they're equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the School 42 graduate could be an even better coder than the university graduate.
But not an engineer.
But doesn't know, let's say, complexity theory in the same depth.
Okay.
As do we need that? I don't know, but it depends on you. But they're mastering different things. So comparing them, saying that 42 is more efficient in that sense, is not apples to apples. So the fact that it's faster and it takes less time doesn't mean it's more efficient.
But if you are looking at the marketable skill of coding, that could apply or not.
If that's all you're interested in, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would go to university because
this is
I
not an
want to learn
argument
the
against
math
university.
Part. But what I love about 42 is the fact that it's very much challenge based and project based. In other words, you're instead of learning something and then applying it, you learn it because you have to survive the process.
Have to apply it.
And you have to apply it, and the only way to apply it is to learn it. That's a beautiful concept. And yes, it is a very efficient way of learning. In that case, for natural born coders, for everybody else, you get eliminated during the piscine. So we can talk about that as well. But yeah, it's efficient.
And still on this efficiency topic, is there a risk when we look at the learning process through this lens of efficiency? Is there a risk that we miss when, I'm going to call it slowness, is waste, like is inefficiency versus incubation? So there is you need a certain stress or a certain difficulty or complexity level in your learning process to achieve that learning output.
Right.
So is there a risk at looking at efficiency where you think everything is waste instead of being part of the process?
Yeah, and that's precisely why, even though learning efficiency is a concept we came up with literally 15 years ago, and we applied at TUMO, we don't talk about it much because the risk of misinterpretation is pretty big, to be very honest. So people might mistake efficiency for speed. And so they might think you shouldn't value this process of spending hours and days perfecting your craft or thinking about something deeply. That's not inefficient. It's just giving it the time it needs to mature, respecting the process. And so there is that risk if you misinterpret it. However, it is good practice when you're designing instructional design, designing curriculum, to challenge yourself and say, can I make this more efficient? Or am I relying on the goodwill and the captive audience effect of the student to say, oh, it's okay if it takes them 3 days. If I work really hard, maybe I can achieve the same outcome in less time. But they're here. They don't have another choice. They're not paying.
So you relate that to the walkaway pedagogy. It even makes more sense.
Exactly, yes. And one example I give is learning languages. So when Marilu and I moved to Spain, we tried to learn Spanish before moving. We spent a lot of time learning Spanish. Didn't learn anything almost. And within weeks of being there, we had learned more than all that initial process. Now, that only means that in certain circumstances, you learn faster and you learn better. It's not like we learned fast. We also learned it more fundamentally with all the nuances, etc. So the environment, the learning environment, the platform matters. And so if you're designing one from scratch, it is incumbent upon you, and it's a right of the learner to expect that you will design something that's respectful of their time.
Awesome. So we'll go into learner's right in a second. I just had one short question before, which is, and you mentioned this right in the beginning, which is there's this sentence you have where you say, young people do not necessarily have short attention spans. They may simply have an intuitive grasp of efficient learning. So the question is, what do teenagers understand about bad learning environments that adults keep rationalizing?
Well, the fact that their time is valuable and they have a lot they want to do. And So adults see students, school systems, as vessels for learning, and they're just students. No, they're human beings which have a lot of aspects to their lives, and their learning curiosity is way beyond what you're about to teach them. So you can't assume that that's all they're worth, is being vessels for what you want to teach them. And so yes, they have short attention spans, partly because they are very anxious about everything else they want to be doing.
So into learners' rights, which we kind of summed up in the last couple of questions. What is this? Is learning rights the simple concept, the simple but yet not grasped concept of it is a learner's right to have access to learning the most efficient way? Is that what defines this learner right framework?
More fundamentally, is they have the right to demand as much value for themselves as commensurate with the amount of effort and time you're asking them to put in. Imagine that they have other options. I know that in school systems they don't have other options, but imagine that they had other options. How would you walk away pedagogy? How would you deal with them in order to respect that? And it is their right. It should be. It's not currently. They don't have the right to walk away from school, right? But you should act as if they have the right to demand that. And it will just increase the quality of learning.
Is it possible, and now I'm mixing up a whole bunch of the topics we spoken so far, is it possible to use the mindset of the walk away pedagogy in a system where you cannot walk away?
Yes, obviously, if it's not likely, because
is the real life restriction a necessary condition for walk away design traits, features to be implemented?
If you think about it as an economist, yes, because you have
incentives.
to have the right incentives for people to do that. And if they don't have the incentives, they're not going to do it. But theoretically, it's not impossible. And you have many educators within that system that do an amazing job of respecting the right of the learner, being very worried about, am I doing this right? As opposed to, you're there, you have to do this. I'm going to give you the exam. And we sometimes romanticize that, right? So let's say the guru, the sensei, right, that says, bring me a rock that expresses the essence of rock. You bring something that, no, that's not it. Try again. That's a very bad learning process. It would be great if they explain to you what the hell they're talking about and what are the features you should be looking for. But of course, that, to exaggerate a little bit, that apprentice that's bringing the rock is also kind of doing the kanji breakfast for the master and so on. So it's kind of the rights of that learners are very limited, right? And so the incentive of the master to have them learn quickly and go away as opposed to keep doing their kanji breakfast is very low.
Okay. Change of topic. There's this article you wrote with Zachary Pardos about a year ago, maybe, about the Frankenstein curriculum, where, given the advent of AI, AI can decompose learning into smaller modular units and reassemble them effectively. So it's kind of an atomization of learning content. What kinds of understanding do you think resists this atomization? So what could we lose with this atomization of content?
Right. Look, there's something you lose immediately, which is when you design a curriculum, you have a strategy, a sequence, and you want to put people in a situation where they're mastering something, where they're overcoming a challenge, because you know that 3 modules later, you'll kind of come back to that and you use it. If the atomization means that putting these atoms together into a curriculum then loses that strategic intent, that's not good.
Okay.
And so it would still work, but it requires recognizing that the macro level of how you string things together is not just a sequence of learning episodes, it's a strategy.
And so TUMO puts a lot of effort in building its own proprietary content. Will TUMO evolve into more of a curation of existing content?
Well, we already do that, by the way. If you look at a lot of our activities, we're using open source tools and content and things like that. And packaging them together. Yes, we would love to go to the extreme with that and be a platform for packaging content, but it's in practice it doesn't quite work. We've done it to the extent that we can, but then precisely for this reason, because you have a strategy, how lucky are you going to get that other people have developed all these modules that actually fit together fit nicely in that way? So we have had to kind of be a little more practical and pragmatic and less theoretical about it, and often develop our own pieces, many of our own pieces, to as interspersed with open source content. So in practice, it's hard to do, and we don't want to kind of sacrifice learning outcomes just for the beauty of the theory.
Okay, sounds good. AI in education.
Yeah,
hot topic. What should young people learn that AI will not learn for them?
Yeah, there's this big paradox in AI, which the phrase we use is AI can teach you what you don't need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if AI can fix your bicycle, it means now it can teach you how to fix the bicycle, because it knows how to fix bicycles, except you're less motivated now to learn how to fix a bicycle because the robot can do it for you. So why would you learn? So anything that AI can teach you becomes less interesting to learn at a certain level, right? And so if we believe that AI will evolve to a level where it can design buildings better than most architects, it can teach better than most teachers, it can fix bicycles, then what's left to learn? What would we learn? And that brings us back to the motivation idea, that the one thing that almost by definition remains for you is to come up with projects, come up with things to do, come up with questions to ask. And I don't think you would ever delegate that to an AI, because the AI may have its own projects, and someday if it really becomes almost sentient or whatever, but that's another story. For the purposes of working with AI systems that are very productive and proficient in doing things, you're still the one that needs to come up with projects. And so
is it the what and the who, and AI would be the how?
AI would be the how, but the what in terms of what do you want to achieve, what do you want to build, why you want to do it, those are things that will remain in your hands. But there's another aspect, which is we have to be cognizant. Look, I like to talk about in physics, there's a theory of conservation of energy. Which means energy changes types. Like you go from kinetic energy to heat, etc., devolving towards heat. But the amount of energy is not diminished. I think we've seen this time and time again, and we'll see it again with AI, which is the amount of learning, the amount of friction and pain in the learning process, and the effort we put into it will not change. We'll still learn a lot. It's just different things at a different level. So it's almost like the theory of conservation of learning. It will become more and more abstract. And I give the example of programming languages. We don't program with assembly language anymore, which was how we programmed before. We needed to understand how the computers work. And people panicked.
Low level.
Yeah, low-level programming. When the high-level programming languages came up, were invented, people started panicking. Oh, these programmers, these kids won't know how computers work. How could they possibly? It turned out fine. They do
Something
amazing
with like
things.
calculator and mathematicians.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So you keep going up in levels of abstraction, but the amount of interesting learning to do, even though it's hard to predict what it will be exactly, it's going to be fine.
Is there a risk, a more civilized, like just on what you just said? Is there a more civilizational risk? Let's say. I think that the example with low level to higher level programming languages, or with like calculators and mathematics, with AI, that jump might be slightly bigger. So the gap between what general society is learning versus the real science and knowledge behind everything, that gap might become wider and wider. So is that something that concerns you?
Yes, very much. So the transition is going to be very painful It's not like a calculator. You said it's even in the Industrial Revolution, where the technological leap was maybe not as mind-blowing as what we're seeing with AI. It took decades and decades of a lot of suffering and injustice and people leading miserable lives until now we're at a point where we're benefiting from that. I think each of us has a responsibility to try to address mitigating that impact. The way TUMO does it is that kids who come to TUMO, we equip them with the abilities to ride that wave and to become super learners, so they're not victims of the process. But we're not solving the most global societal issues that come with that, part of which is about concentration of wealth and power, right? The efficiency gains from AI will probably go mostly to the bosses and not to people like us. That's an issue. The fact that social interactions between young people might be replaced with interaction with AI, it's hard to predict what that will do to social networks in the short term. And so, we should be very worried. We should be deliberately, and as we're doing at TUMO, designing our curriculum around that. Even though it's not a question of losing our cognitive abilities to AI. That's not going to be the issue. The issue will be more the transitional pain of this new technology.
So if AI, just kind of reinforcing that point, so if AI can explain, quiz, simulate, personalize, and this said, and the fact that the social aspect is a core aspect of the learning process, what remains at its core human in the education process or in the learning process? Is it just the socialization?
No, it's not just. It's the coming together to make things and do projects.
So the projects, the building.
So I think schools, if you, now I make a prediction, the ones that survive and remain efficient will be places where people come together, kids come together to learn together, to create things, using AI to do all the things that they were learning before. So they will not learn necessarily graphic design or coding in Python, etc. But they will still be doing projects together, just like they do now in workshops. So that is very, let's say, human. It's very social, and it requires even more than before coming together in person to do stuff. So that's, I think, the transition that will need to be made, and it's a positive one. Again, very painful transition, but it will lead to something much more. I would like to live in that future, kind of skipping the next several decades.
So TUMO obviously focuses on 12 to 18, and we're introducing Gen AI, and I mean across the board. Do you think there's an age where it's too early to introduce AI in the sense that you might need to build some foundational cognitive ability to process stuff, and AI too early could be an impediment to that?
I think that in the long term, no. If you're learning how to use, let's say, a tractor to dig a hole, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to manually dig a hole any longer. So you'll become hopeless at digging holes if you don't have a tractor. But in a world where you do have the tractor, worrying about the fact that if we introduce them to tractors early, then they will never learn how to dig a hole becomes a ridiculous proposition. So, however, it's not the case quite yet. So as a parent, you have to worry about, okay, let's say I go completely towards introducing AI tools, but university acceptance still is not quite there yet. So my kid will actually not get into university and I will be doing the disservice. So yes, we should worry. I would be very careful about introducing even social media to kids. You have to do it in a way that's counterbalanced by a whole other set of constraints. But not because it's fundamentally, it won't be the case decades from now.
It's more about the transition.
It's about the transition.
What is the role of originality, or how do you look at original creation in the context of AI? And I think this is a very hot topic within TUMO as well, right? So we're
absolutely.
Creative Technology Center. We're building creators in all senses. Originality is a topic.
Right.
How do you feel about this in the context of AI?
Yeah, so I think the question is in the context of AI can do things that if a person did them before, they would be considered very original, except AI is doing them. You'll have to displace your medium of original expression to another more abstract level to remain original, right? And so I always give the example of this early on where when we started being able to make short movie snippets with AI, we had a learning lab where they exclusively used AI to make a movie, short film.
Mhm.
And at that time, it was very hard to keep continuity between,
6 second
6
clips.
seconds and the next 6 seconds. The characters look different and so on. So the students actually used that to make a short film called Falling in Love, which kind of used the idea of you see the lover in a way that represents your imagination more than how they really are, kind of thing.
Mhm.
And the fact that the characters were changing, the faces were changing of the girl and the boy from one frame to the other, they use that as a feature of the film, right?
Mhm.
And so they're using the feature of a medium
As
to
input.
as input to do something very original, very cool and fun to watch, despite the fact that all the images were created by AI. It works. So you can always go to this next level
Mhm.
of abstraction and create. And in fact, when the kind of the cubists and the impressionists and so on emerged in painting, their thing wasn't being able to do realistic painting of angels and nudes
Mhm.
better than before. No, they completely subverted that, and they were doing something completely different with the same medium, paint. And it works. That's how it's evolved all the time. And so there, I don't think there's any issue.
And with the implementation of AI at TUMO, it's a fairly recent thing. So Yerevan, as far as I understand, has been since January piloting the Gen AI skill area,
Yes.
co-learner, etc. International rollout happening now in
As
the
we
coming
speak,
weeks. What are you most excited about? And is there anything you feel you still didn't figure out of how you're implementing TUMO AI at TUMO?
Well, first of all, there's two aspects. One is how to teach AI,
Mhm.
quote unquote. That's what this new area is about. The other is to what extent to introduce AI within the other skill areas. And let me start with the teach AI part. There we have a lot to figure out still, but it's really exciting. So the most exciting part, first of all, is the fact that it's super adaptive. So this dream of adapting to the student's speed and going deeper if they're going faster and etc., that's working really well. Much better than what I'm already calling our traditional self-learning activity format. And we're discovering things every day in that vein. For example, the AI coach introducing a rubric and the co-learner and the learner sort of colluding to try to get the higher score in that rubric together is much more effective when the AI and the student are collaborating in that than if the student were expected to do it. They might not even realize that's what they need to do. Anyway.
Is that an opportunity because self-learning truly goes at the pace of the student? It's really at your own rhythm. Workshops, you can get in the workshop at your own rhythm, but within the workshop,
That's right.
It's a collective rhythm just because of the logistical nature
and
of
it's
it.
also part of the learning process that you have to adapt to the rhythm.
Is this an opportunity to differentiate rhythm even within workshops? Or is that not an objective?
Well, first of all, it's making the personalization within self-learning much more effective across all the topics. So we're going to extend it to not just AI, but to all the other topics.
Okay.
Within workshops, to some extent, you still the constraint within workshops that we like is still working with other people together and adapting to the pace of the slower or faster team member, etc. So no, I don't think that will change too much. We don't want it to change. We want that constraint to remain. But let me give you a final example about how we're thinking about introducing AI within coding.
Okay.
The huge debate in TUMO right now is, should we still be teaching coding by hand, given that that's not what the employers will need? Of course, yes, because somebody who knows how to code is going to be a much better agentic coding engineer.
Vibe coder, yeah. Whatever.
Yeah, we don't call it vibe coding anymore. But at the same time, it's a bit unrealistic to assume that we're going to be able to get away with teaching coding and syntax by hand, despite the fact that you don't actually need it. So we are now coming up with ideas on how to solve that. We have some very interesting ideas.
Okay. Do you want to share some of them?
Well, I'll share one. For example, one theory, one hypothesis is that we will introduce agentic coding, and the whole challenge will be about looking at the code generated by AI and understanding it and finding bugs in it.
Mm-hmm.
That will at the same time expose you to syntax and logic and loops, etc., without the friction of having to code it yourself line by line. Will we do that? Maybe to some extent, maybe fully. We're going to test it, but these are ideas that we're generating. But that's just to say that's a very different pedagogical challenge than how to teach AI. It's how to teach given that AI exists now.
Interesting. So Pegor, last question for this conversation on scaling TUMO. So this year is TUMO's 15th anniversary.
That's right.
And congratulations on this mark. One thing you mentioned right in the beginning is, or actually not in this conversation, but in one of the videos, the onboarding videos, you and Marilu mentioned that one of the restrictions you wanted to have was scale. You didn't want to build one more beautifully pilot or success story that goes on a nice slide but has no real system impact. So yeah, one of TUMO's value proposition is scale. That's very obvious. What parts of TUMO are truly scalable, and what parts depend on culture, architecture, or unusual leadership?
Look, it always, a successful TUMO is always run by implementing partners who are exceptional in the sense of their vision, their shared values, and so on. But there's a lot of those. And there's a big thirst for doing things in a different way in education. So that's scalable because the supply is big, but you still definitely need, and it's dependent on visionary leadership, and that's what drives success. The part that's more difficult to scale has to do with really the financial aspect. I mean, because TUMO is free of charge, we have to face it. In business, the more clients you have, the more money you make. At TUMO, the more students you have, the more it ends up costing you. There are some economies of scale, but in the end, if you double the number of students, maybe you don't double your cost, but it increases a lot. And so in that sense, we're looking at whether we can at least mitigate that and reduce that cost per student and to make it more scalable. But that's the big impediment to scale, especially in a context where the full value that TUMO is bringing is not recognized, let's say, by the state, where they would pay for it just like they would pay for other public services. It's not the case yet in most places, not fully. And so really for me, that's the only impediment is we're saying we can scale indefinitely, but that's dependent on cost, on the ability to fund it.
So I mean, I think that it would be obvious to state that ideally you would want it to move everywhere, but is there a specific context or like use case of TUMO that you feel makes more sense in the expansion, like a specific region or a specific type of territory, or is there anything like that?
I think there's one perspective, which is about where it's needed most and where it will have more impact, right? TUMO is in some cities which have a lot of resources, and if TUMO didn't exist, kids would be able to find other resources, whereas in other cities, and this is even true in Armenia, TUMO is the only interesting thing happening in the whole city in terms of education. And so the impact is much greater. And we would like to be in all places because the net positive is there anywhere. And even in cities like, let's say, Amsterdam, we're in this neighborhood that's mainly immigrant population. And so the impact is still quite significant, relatively speaking. But when we looked at our global map at some point, we realized we're very Europe-centric. Other than Armenia, it's all like in Western European countries. Mostly, we expanded to the US and Japan. That's still kind of global north, right? And so the fact that we're now in Mumbai, we're looking towards Angola, we're looking towards the global south is strategic for us. And it's important that we at least have that balance, if not concentrate more. If we can't be everywhere, at least be in the places where we have the biggest impact.
Is that from these like initial experiences in the global south, as you refer to, does the TUMO model work equally well comparing to Europe, Armenia, or are there core adjustments that you have to make?
The short answer is it works really well.
Okay.
Sometimes even better.
Okay.
Better only in the sense that because kids in those places have fewer options, they're even more motivated intrinsically to come to TUMO. The curriculum, the fact that it's self-paced, the fact that it's very accessible, that it's based on things that are fine-tuned for the teenage mind and heart, makes it really easy. It turns out teenagers have more in common by virtue of being teenagers than any geographic differences. They have their own global country, if you will. So no, those are not impediments. On the contrary.
What is the hardest thing to preserve when you scale an educational experience like TUMO? Is it the quality? Is it ethos? Is it motivation of the operating partner? Is it culture? Is it invisible design choices or something else?
Well, look, for us as the founders or the creators of TUMO, the core team that's started from the beginning, we went from being a school where we actually knew most of the kids, and we met them on the street. We could talk to them. We knew who they were. We almost knew their names invariably. To now working with a student population that we never meet, and that's required some adjustments. The previous version was a bit more fun when you actually could interact personally with them, but we understand that that's not scalable. So that's the main difference, is going from a school to a tech company in a way, or a school and a tech company at the same time, with all the additional constraints and challenges of a tech company, whether that's staffing or people want to work from home, that kind of thing.
Is there anything you feel that TUMO has lost because of its international expansion? I mean, you just referred the perspective of size in a way, but I mean, apart from that, in terms of the program, is there anything that you feel that by diluting in a way the operation like globally, where you have to decentralize and delegate to implementing partners, etc. Right. Do you feel anything has lost?
I don't know. I mean, first of all, we've gained so much from international expansion that it's if there's something we lost, maybe I'm not seeing it because I'm overwhelmed with the. First of all, quality improved because if you have
clients,
not just the local Armenian mother looking at the content, but a German mother, very demanding. With all the diversity that brings, it's forced us to up our game and to kind of smoothen the rough edges. For one thing, be much more, let's say, GDPR compliant, which is a good thing, privacy, etc. Which before we were a bit like a decade ago, we were much more lax about that stuff. It's also helped us kind of get to the core secret sauce of TUMO, as opposed to all the additional things that might have been location specific. So TUMO now is what works everywhere, as opposed to incidental kind of features. It also has, because of the license fee everyone pays into the common pool. Now, by the way, Armenian centers are also paying a license fee, which is new. So all centers, including Armenian ones, pay a license fee, and that gives us a lot more resources to do R&D. The whole AI development that we did would not have been possible if we didn't have all this income coming in, of which some part goes to R&D. And so lots of benefits. No downsides.
No downside. Awesome. Very rapid questions is, how big is TUMO now in terms of staff? Rough number.
Well, if I don't count the staff in Portugal and other
Yeah,
places,
no, in TUMO HQ, let's say.
about 800 people.
800 people.
That includes about 3/4 of that is our teaching staff, our coaches, workshop leaders, because we have a huge operation in Armenia. But about 20 to 25% is headquarters staff. So it's big.
Okay. So that's pretty big. Is there any specific location that you'd love to open that is still not open? Like personally, that you would love to see it open?
Yeah. Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia.
Or in more general, like Vietnam.
Okay.
Would be an amazing location. There's so much energy, so many people, and it's so different from our other locations. I mean, our Asian location now is Japan. Very different. Japan is much more Western in that sense. So yeah, if I had to pick one, I would say
Vietnam.
How
far away are we from it?
We have a conversation going.
Okay.
Let's see.
Awesome. Pegor, thank you so much for your time and openness in all of these questions. It's a pleasure to be part of the TUMO network. And I hope we can do this again in a few months, the version 2.0.
Great. Thanks for the initiative.
Thank you so much.